So now we learned about state. And state, as you can probably tell by now, is a key concept in React. Now there are a couple of things I want to clarify about useState and about why we use a const here, for example. Now first let's start with one important thing which I did mention in the last lecture already. useState registers some state, so some value as a state, for the component in which it is being called. And I want to be even more precise here. It registers it for a specific component instance. For example, expense item here is being used 4 times, right? In expenses.js, we have 4 expense items. Now, every item receives its own separate state, which is detached from the other states. We have one expense item definition here, but then this function is basically called 4 times when we create 4 expense items. And every time it's called, a new separate state is created. Of course, in the same way, but managed independently by React. So if we change the title in the first expense item, the other ones are not affected because they have their own state. That's really important. It's on a per component instance basis. So we have separate states even if we create a component more than once. And that's of course crucial because it would be a rather undesired behavior if we change something in one item and all the other items are updated as well. So that's a good thing to have. Now in addition, whenever state changes, because we click a button in this case, it's only this component function and only that specific instance where this component is being used where React will re-evaluate it. And you can tell that this is the fact if you add another console log here in the component function itself where you say expense item evaluated by React. This will be called whenever the expense item component function is being executed. And therefore, if I reload, we see it's called 4 times. Which makes a lot of sense because we're using expense item 4 times in expenses. So 4 separate instances of this component are being created. But if I now click on change title in one of the expense items, we see it's only printed once. Which is basically happening because of what I just explained. Only that specific instance is being updated and therefore being re-evaluated, and the other instances are not affected by that state change. And that's important to keep in mind, that state really is separated on a per component instance basis. Now there's one other thing which could be confusing, and that's the fact that I'm using const here. Why am I using const here when we do eventually assign a new value? Well, keep in mind that we're not assigning a value with the equal sign. That would indeed fail, but that is not how we assign a new value when we update a state. Instead, we call this state updating function. And the concrete value is simply managed somewhere else by React. By calling useState, we tell React that it should manage some value for us. We never see that variable itself. So therefore, we just call a function and we never assign a new value to title with the equal operator. And therefore, using a const is absolutely fine. How do we get the latest title value then though? Well, keep in mind that the component function is re-executed when the state is updated, and therefore, of course, this line of code, line 9, also is executed again whenever the component function is executed again. So if we call setTitle and we assign a new title, that leads to this component being called again, and therefore this new title, this updated title, is fetched from React, which manages this state for us. Basically, we go to React and say, hey, please give me that latest title state which I told you to manage for me. And React provides us this latest state in this array, which useState always returns. So we always get a brand new snapshot of that state when this component function re-executes. That's how this works under the hood. Now you might be wondering if that doesn't mean that we always overwrite any state changes with props title again here. And here the special thing is that React keeps track of when we call useState in a given component instance for the first time. And when we call it for the first time ever, it'll take that argument as an initial value. But if a component is then re-executed because of such a state change, for example, React will not reinitialize the state. Instead, it will detect that this state had been initialized in the past, and it will just grab the latest state, which is based on some state update, for example, and give us that state instead. So this initial value is really only considered when this component function is being executed for the first time for a given component instance. And I know that this is a lot of knowledge about state, and it might be confusing to a certain extent. It is just important to understand how state works under the hood, because if you don't fully understand that, then you will run into problems in more complex React applications where suddenly some value isn't updated as you expected it to be. That's why I'm explaining this in great detail. In a nutshell, using state is simple though. You just register state with useState. You always get back two values, the value itself and the updating function. You call the updating function whenever the state should change. And you use that first element whenever you want to use the state value, like here, for outputting it in the JSX code. And React will do the rest, and it will re-execute the component function and re-evaluate the JSX code, therefore, whenever the state changes. That's state, and that's an important concept, because it's state which adds reactivity to our application. Without state, our user interface would never change. But with state and with listening to events, we can make sure that we can react to user input and that such input can result in a visible change on our screen. So state is a super important concept, and of course being able to listen to user events is also important, as you can tell.